My name is Simon Holliday, and this is my home, Hong Kong. Most people know this place as one of Asia's leading financial centres, of skyscrapers and busy streets. But I'm an open water swimmer, and this city is also a swimmer's paradise. There are so many stories along the edges of the Pacific Rim, lost deep beneath the waves. In this series, I intend to swim out and find them. This is the first of the 7 swims. Christmas Day, 1941, the British are on the verge of surrendering Hong Kong. A small band of men make a last-ditch attempt to escape. This is their story. For a century prior to 1997, Hong Kong had been a British colony. But on the 8th of December 1941, at the same time as Pearl Harbor, Japan attacked from the Chinese border. Within a week, Britain had abandoned the Hong Kong mainland and retreated to Hong Kong Island. 10 days later, they would lose it all. The first time in history that a British Crown colony had surrendered to an invading force. Before hoisting the white flag, the British considered who needed to be evacuated. The highest ranking Chinese government official in the colony was a one-legged admiral who had been working undercover as a stockbroker whilst orchestrating the local resistance against the Japanese. His name was Admiral Chan Chak. Getting Chan out safely could strengthen Britain's fragile relationship with China and frustrate their mutual enemy.
I think he was an extraordinary man. But in history remembers him for having great integrity, great bravery, great loyalty, great honesty, and all of these values Sun Yat-sen, the father of China, noted and valued in him. In 1938, he came to Hong Kong to seek medical care for his left leg, which had been injured repeatedly during the many wars he fought. And unfortunately, he had his leg amputated then, but he stayed on to become the Chinese government's representative for political and military affairs.
Chan's aide-de-camp was Henry Su, a naval lieutenant commander. Still in his late 20s, he stood at 6'3", making him one of the tallest men in the Chinese Navy. Like his boss, he was a talented and versatile administrator. He was also an Olympic swimmer and water polo player. Chan's stockbroker's office was behind me on the 4th floor of the Pedder building. Across the street was the Gloucester Hotel, where David McDougall, the head of the Ministry of Information, had his makeshift office. A fluent Cantonese speaker, McDougall had known Chan for 10 years, and in peace times they had played tennis and drank baijiu in Canton, becoming close friends at a time when relationships between senior British and Chinese officials was rare. McDougall and his assistant Ted Ross knew that Hong Kong was going to fall, and at any time they were looking to escape. The opportunity came when they heard of the plan to evacuate the Admiral.
Dad had come down from Shanghai, where he had been working for a Canadian shipping company, but things were getting too hot in Shanghai. Dad had been working as an ambulance driver and was dodging bullets, trying to bring wounded back from the battlefields. But it got to a point where the company he was working with wasn't prepared to take the risk, and they posted him to Hong Kong, which was supposed to be safer than staying in Shanghai. It was in Hong Kong that he met David McDougall. David was the head of Ministry of Information and persuaded my father that he could best serve the war effort by joining him at the Ministry of Information. They knew that Hong Kong would not last very long under the onslaught of the Japanese, which was tremendous. It was really just a matter of days. And David had been given charge to make sure that Admiral Chan Chak was safely taken off the island and delivered back to the Chinese. And to that end, there was an escape plot put together. My father and David agreed that they would pick the Admiral up from central Hong Kong near the Gloucester Hotel once the surrender had been announced. They couldn't escape before then because they were worried they might have been accused of desertion.
Ross had managed to acquire a discarded Buick motorcar which he parked behind the Gloucester building. He would be one of the getaway drivers escorting McDougall. Admiral Chan would be driven in a 4-seater Austin by Sue. By now, Japanese soldiers were pouring onto the island just a few hundred metres away from where the cars were parked. As the incessant sound of war grew louder, they started their engines and sped west down Queen's Road. Soon the Imperious buildings gave way to more makeshift shop fronts, stalls and grimy tenements. Along winding streets they climbed up the road to the partially destroyed university. Emerging from the city, they headed south down the narrow coastal road, past forts at Belchers and Mount Davis, and onto Pok Fulam, passing Queen Mary Hospital and the dairy farm. Little did they know that just below them were 2 camouflaged motor torpedo boats, the very boats that had been assigned to rescue them.
When the Japanese attacked, the Navy consisted of 1 mine-laying destroyer, HMS Thrashing, a number of river gunboats, and the 8 motor torpedo boats of the 2nd MTB flotilla. The motor torpedo boats were the first built for the Royal Navy for the Second World War. My father's role with the MTBs was he was an acting petty officer on MTB 07. The MTB's role was primarily torpedoing, hence the name motor torpedo boats, and also dropping depth charges where necessary. They also assisted in troop movement and in ammunition running to the troops. And on the day that the Japanese attacked Hong Kong Island by sea, the MTBs went in to try and disrupt them crossing from Kowloon across to North Point. The MTBs laid up in Telegraph Bay primarily because it was a safe haven and as far away from the action as possible as they could possibly get, bearing in mind that they had to be camouflaged during the day because of aircraft attack, and it was easy access to get to Aberdeen.
Aberdeen is now a bustling metropolis, but what they saw as they reached their destination in the late afternoon of Christmas Day 1941 was a small fishing village in disarray. Aberdeen's dry docks, its promenade, fish market and harbour wall lay in ruins. Henry Sue would recall dead bodies laying along the road, covered by thin straw sleeping mats. And the motor torpedo boats, their ticket out of Hong Kong, were nowhere to be seen. Chan, McDougall, Sue and Ross made their way here to the industrial school, which had been repurposed as an army base, to see if they had information on the whereabouts of the MTBs. They were told by Commander Montague, the man in charge, that it had been deemed unsafe for the MTBs to stay in the harbour and that they had either left or were hiding out among the islands. This was not the news that they wanted to hear. They knew that they were just hours away from capture, torture and even death. Increasingly desperate, they returned to the harbour front and saw some men working on a small launch. They explained their plight, and the men agreed to let them commandeer the boat if they would take them with them. They wouldn't get all the way to mainland China as they had hoped, but it might take them to an outlying island and buy them time. The atmosphere was eerily subdued as they quietly made their way out of the harbour, past upended boats and out towards the expanse of the South China Sea. It was at this spot in Aberdeen Harbour, between Hong Kong Island to the east and the island of Apleichau to the west, where the escapees heard a single shot, then another, then the sickly rattle of machine gun fire. The Japanese had taken up positions behind me on Brick Hill.
You know, from all accounts, there were bullets flying around everywhere and everyone had to swim. They were not going to survive if they didn't swim. So Henry, his aide-de-camp, he helped him, take off his heavy clothing. He removed his wooden leg, which I am told contained 100,000 Hong Kong dollars, which was their escape fund, right, to pay people off along the way. And, getting ready to jump into this water, which they didn't think that they would survive. And just before this happened, he got shot in the wrist.
My father was one of the last people off the boat. He stripped off and neatly folded his clothes and put them on a seat. He did that, I think, to try and bring some sense of calm amidst the chaos that was happening. He kept saying to himself, "Stay calm. There's got to be a way out of this somehow." And with that, he dived off the boat into the icy waters of Aberdeen in the middle of a Hong Kong winter and swam for as far as he could towards Ap Lei Chau, but under the water to avoid the bullets.
The swimmers fanned out across the channel with only the waves as cover from the torrent of machine gun fire. Sue, the Olympic swimmer, tried to pull Chan through the water, but the Admiral told him he would manage on his own. It was now every man for himself. It seemed just a matter of time before the snipers found their mark, or that Japanese boats would come out and seize them from the water. But they kept going, one arm in front of the other, every stroke further away from danger and closer to safety.
As it turned out, my father was the first person to reach Ap Lei Chau. He'd held his breath for as long as he could underwater, eventually having to come up, and he swam the last portion on the surface. But when he got there, he found that there was very little shelter. He was clinging onto the rocks. It was getting a little bit dark by now, but the machine gun bullets were still hitting the granite rock face around him, and shards of granite were hitting him in the face. He was surprised to hear and then see David McDougall making his way into Ap Lei Chau. My father swam out and helped David into the rocks where they were taking shelter. Realized that as he was helping David out, the back of David's coat was covered in blood. Realized, of course, that he'd been shot. And my father said that at that moment he realized that David simply didn't give a damn anymore. And David stayed on a rock shelf there, unable to move.
Chan and Sue had landed here, on the edge of Ap Lei Chau. The light was starting to fade. And although they had made it to shore, bullets were still being fired from all directions. With no sign of the MTBs, their future was uncertain.
Well, Uncle Henry dragged him from the water, took off his shirt, and wrapped up my grandfather's bleeding wrist. And then they were hid behind a rock. My grandfather took off his ring and gave it to Uncle Henry and said, "Please give this to my wife." So my grandfather was left alone, wounded, behind a rock, with one pistol and a promise from Uncle Henry saying that he would be back.
Several of the other men joined from different points along the shoreline. One of the volunteer cadets, Holger Christensen, had heard a distant sound of a motor engine and was ordered to run like a hare in that direction. Sure enough, as he reached the bay, the young Danes saw 3 MTBs. He danced excitedly to get their attention and started swimming out to the boats. The rest of the group decided their only option was to climb over the hilltop to see what was on the other side. Beginning their descent towards the bay, they saw the same 3 boats but couldn't make out whether they were British. Meanwhile, the British Navy officers on the MTBs were also struggling to identify the men on the hillside and promptly opened fire. The despairing men had to find shelter once again in the scrub. By now, Christensen had swum out to MTB 27. Engines were cut back and he was hauled out of the sea with a boat hook. On deck, weapons were lowered as the crew finally identified him as ally. The others tentatively made their way to the water's edge. Ross, holding up a delirious McDougall, were the last to emerge. "It's okay," said a voice from the boat. "Come on down." Ross would later recall that it was the most beautiful and gratifying voice he had ever heard. All of the men who had swum across had been accounted for. except for Admiral Chan Chak. Henry and others rowed around the island and back to the beach where they had left him. But the Admiral was nowhere to be found. They feared the worst. But just as they were giving up hope, a large stone came rolling down the hill. They made their way up the slope, calling as they went. "Merry Christmas," came a reply. Just above them was the Admiral, huddled behind a rock, clutching his revolver in his good hand. The 5 remaining motor torpedo boats regrouped, started their engines, and made their way single file down the East Lama Channel bound for China. Out of the 17 swimmers, 12 had got through, with 5 missing, presumed dead. They were now sailing to China, where they would have to break through Japanese lines to reach safety. The mood was calm but somber.
The men on the boats could only have guessed at what was happening on shore as they sped past, gazing across the water at the dark, battle-scarred hills. But there can be few of them who didn't wonder at the twist of fate that had left so many others facing captivity, torture, and worse, while they disappeared into the night. Passing Deepwater Bay and Repulse Bay, they remembered happier times with their families on the beach or at the country club. Now their hilltop homes were ablaze, and their families were awaiting their fate at the hands of enemy soldiers. They passed the Stanley Peninsula and heard the muffled sound of explosions and gunfire, the last stand of British and Canadian forces, unaware that the territory had already been lost. It would be another 4 hours before the message of the surrender would get through, and Hong Kong would finally fall silent.